literature, although unrecorded, dates back to ancient history. It is part and parcel of the history of people of the continent. In the modern African literature, writers like Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, Najib Mahfouz of Egypt, and Al-Taib Salih of Sudan have claimed huge reputation. They are considered as the fathers of modern African literature.
Chinua Achebe of blessed memory was not only a Nigerian author, he was celebrated in Africa and across the world. And as you know, he was one of the main brains behind what was a very, in my view, helpful series, the African Writers series, which he edited. And at the time that we had the African Writers series, it gave platform to African authors and also helped to bring African writings very close to Africans in schools in all languages across the continent.
Najib Mahfouz, he was born in one of the very inspiring parts of Cairo, the old part of Cairo. It's a suburb called, a district called Al-Jamaliyah. Jamaliyah is in the old part of Cairo, surrounded by the very historical and very inspiring artistic atmosphere. This played an important role in his life. He studied philosophy, and he was at the Cairo University. He's a graduate of the philosophy department. So also this philosophical view affected his writings and his artistic performance.
Taib Saleh, we consider him as a Sudanese icon, first of all, and he was a very famous novelist, even not so Sudan or Africa, this is around the globe. Taib Saleh was born in 1928 in Karmakol village in far north in Sudan, and he was died in 2009 in London. He was a novelist and a columnist also in newspapers. He first joined the University of Khartoum, and then he shifted to University of London in Britain. He worked with the BBC Arabic Service for a long time as a producer of cultural programs, and then he go to the UNESCO in Paris in his last 10 years of life.
The first Africans that started to be educated, especially in mission schools, they took for themselves also the mission of writing, and writing their histories and their stories. So the first generation of African writers, they really start writing about their people.
The Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe is mainly known for his famous novel Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. More than 12 million copies of this book sold worldwide, and it is one of the first novels portraying Africa from an African viewpoint.
Things Fall Apart is an attempt to talk about the clash between African tradition and Western culture, represented by no less a figure than the tragic figure of Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart, who was wedded to his Igbo tradition. And when Western culture crept into the Igbo culture, it resulted in a fight that led ultimately to Okonkwo's tragic death. His choice of subjects and characters, I think, should be an indication. He did not try to bring his characters from outside the continent. And in fact, not only from outside the continent, but from his immediate background, which is he was Igbo, and he did not hide that fact. The Okonkwas and others that he talked about, Ekwensis, they were all names that he drew from his own immediate environment.
Al-Taib Saleh of Sudan is another big name in African literature. He is well known for his famous novel Season of Migration to the North.
I think the most famous novel that he wrote is Season of Immigration to the North. It was very famous around the world. It has been translated into more than 22 languages. That means it reflects his career, his style of narrating. And then the story of the immigration of the North, it combines the agricultural conflicts between modern Africa and the pre- and post-colonial era. It's about, the narrator said that's about a Sudanese man who went to London. He educated there. He tried to practice his economist career in England, and he talked about his relation with an English woman who turned at last as a tragedy, and then after that he came back to his roots, to his deep roots in his village in northern Sudan. He was living in London in a different atmosphere, in a different civilization. But when he began writing, he recalled his roots, and he go back to his village, and even the characters and the whole atmosphere of his novels. It's about the social life in Sudan, which is similar to social life in so many different African countries.
The Egyptian writer Najib Mahfouz is also the other giant in African literature arena. He lived in a very rich time of Egyptian history and witnessed the British occupation of Egypt and many other socio-economic and political changes in his country. These changes were reflected in his artistic works.
He wrote around 35 novels, left around 350 short stories, and he was also talented in writing scenarios for movies, and he wrote scenarios for many movies, and many of his works and novels were translated into very famous and very important movies in the history of filmmaking in Egypt and the whole Arab world.
Like any other African writers, the theme of his novels in his early age of writing was mainly focused on history and the reality of life.
He started by writing historical stories. So the first stage of his novels were mainly focusing on history, historical, mixing of course history with literature. It's not like historian, but inspired by some historical events, historical stories, and putting it into novelistic style. Then after that he moved to one of the very important phases, which is the realism, depicting the evolution of socio-economic evolution of Egypt in the 30s and the 40s. And this time was very important because it was full of political developments and political aspirations. So that these main really bulk of the novels were during that time, and one of his most famous is the trilogy. The trilogy, which has three novels, one called Bain al-Asrain and one called Bain al-Asrain in Arabic means between the two palaces, and the second volume called Qasr al-Shuq, the Palace of Desire, and the third called Al-Sukkariya, the sugar cane or the sugar pot. And these all are translated actually into English, and they are, and to many other languages of course, and they are also transformed into very famous movies and very important in the filmmaking in Egypt.
After African countries became independent from European colonial rule, many writers of the continent have started writing political and philosophical novels.
Africa became an independent continent. And then all the expectations, all the aspirations of the people and people were very happy. There was a kind of utopian atmosphere around. People were believing that the conditions of their lives would really change. But unfortunately, things take time. And things took maybe much time than people would like the things to take. And writers start to write about it.
Arrow of God, man of the people, are somewhat internal but representative of the larger Africa, where you find people in power, as in the man of the people, celebrating African politics, the promises they make, and how short they fall because of corruption that you mentioned and other factors.
The third phase in Naguib Mahfouz was the philosophical or metaphysical phase. That mainly after in more modern times, after the 52 revolution, with the challenges of modern lives for Egyptians. Then he had lots of novels which talk about the existential dilemma or existential crisis of the modern Egyptian in the modern life, the challenges of modern life, the pressures of modern life, and how to find this reconciliation.
In Africa, this highly politicized trend of literature is there very consistently through the different generations.
During pre-colonial and colonial periods, the West regarded Africa as a dark continent with no history and civilization. The first generation of African writers such as Chinua Achebe, Naguib Mahfouz and Al-Taib Saleh started writing literature to regain the lost image of the continent. In his famous book Things Fall Apart, Professor Achebe reflected this matter in detail.
Angle to that book that we must not lose sight of, which was the experience of the colonial district officer at whose bedside on his death was found the manuscript of a book which was entitled The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. Now if you look at that title alone, it was what? The white man came to Africa from the perspective of African tradition to pacify Africans. But the white man also believed that Africans must be pacified because they were primitive, and so they brought civilization. But where do you draw the line in this? From Achebe's point of view, he did not quite believe in the superiority of Western culture, of African culture, and that is why he made the battle very fierce between the traditionalists and those that believed in and embraced Western culture.
The colonial forces and the colonial rulers were saying, using as an argument for colonizing Africans, that they had no history, their past was not really a rich past, they had no civilization, they were looking into Africans as savages. And these kind of things were not only said but also written. And under written form they became very powerful in Europe, especially in European dominions. And Europeans in general terms, the literate ones, started to look into Africa as a man's land, but a no man's culture land.
African stories have been told by few European writers in pre-colonial and colonial periods. But after the independence of African countries, it was dramatically changed. African writers have begun telling African stories from African angle.
The African stories have been reflected by the Europeans and so. But after the independence of African countries, there are so many famous writers. They wrote about their culture, their traditions and so. Like Naguib Mahfouz of Egypt and Chinua Achebe of Nigeria and Al-Taib Saleh of Sudan.
African writers and novelists contributed a great deal to reflect a real image and a first-hand picture and information about the reality of our societies, about our people, about our youth, about our aspirations, about our hopes and our disappointments.
This first big generation of writers, they really had as a mission, and they really accomplished this mission of rendering back to African readers, to African people, this representation of another image of Africa, that Africa was in fact a civilized continent. And it also changed the image that outside Africa readers had from Africa. So it was really, really critical. This first generation is a critical generation.
If we are talking of African Renaissance and Pan-Africanism in 2013, 2014, where we are today, then it means that there has always been an African awareness of who and what we are as Africans and what we want to be. So right now, it is for Africans to give their own narrative from the African angle, not for others to define Africa and provide an angle and a narrative for the people of the continent.
African readers in the different regions of Africa need to read each other's, the writers from the other regions. So I think that it's still very nationalized, the access to the literature. This from the point of view of a reader too. So if you are a Nigerian and if you only read first Nigerian writers, you'll be know only about a small part of the forest.
Today, Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, Najib Mahfouz of Egypt, and Al-Taib Saleh of Sudan are all passed away. Najib Mahfouz in 2006, Al-Taib Saleh in 2009, and Chinua Achebe in 2013. No matter how they are not alive, what they represented and achieved in their lifetime was simply magnificent. They have contributed a lot in fostering African literature one step forward in terms of literary trend and readership.
The extent to which he stepped up African literature would be to see the time when African writing was at its height and today. I almost started this interview with a reference to the African Writers series. We don't have that anymore. And so there are writers out there who are doing tremendous work, who have come up with great books, but somehow those works are lost because there is no platform for them to articulate their work, and also there is no continuity in following. In those good old days, the series were numbered. You would say 1, 2, 3, and if you took any of the number in the series, you would know who, or you could easily say it was this author or that author.
I think that the biggest achievement of all the writers in Africa, that they reflect their culture and their traditions and their civilization to the West within African eyes, not foreign eyes. This is very important.
Well, African literature is really alive, really dynamic, and when we see the big literature collections, we see at the same level we can find in the catalogs African writers with Asian writers, American writers, European writers, so all at the same level.
Najib Mahfouz was the one who took it much steps forward. First in technique, in the real form of a novel as a form of literature expression, and also in language. He was able to get more, not into the very classical language, but more into the day-to-day language used by Egyptians and expressing their daily preoccupations.
language became a very big issue like 50 years ago in one of the big writers conference in 63. One of the panels were about language, and there were two trends. One defended by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he was defending that an African literature written in the colonizer languages could not be considered African literature but European literature. If a writer is writing in English, it will be no longer in spite of the theme, in spite of the topic, in spite of the setting, in spite of anything else, the language would make the choice. If you choose to write in English, you are doing European literature, not African literature. On the other side, there was, in fact, writers like Chinua Achebe arguing that the language was just a tool. And as a tool, writing in English or writing in French or writing in Arabic or in Portuguese, it would be a way to reach a wider audience of readership.
Chinua Achebe was a candidate for Nobel Prize for Literature. Despite his immense contribution for the field of literature, he was not lucky enough to receive that prize in his lifetime.
His recognition around the world, in my view, was the highest prize that any individual could have won, and he got just that. When he died in this embassy, we opened a book of condolence that was signed by many. A lot of the comments that were made were very touching, and it was in death, one may say, that the real value of Chinua Achebe came forth, because while he was alive, not many eulogized him, but in his death, he rose, he soared, to the highest height, and people then realized that he was a great writer.
The Egyptian writer Najib Mahfouz was lucky in receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1988. The award was given in recognition to the Arab and African literature.
Awarding, of course, Najib Mahfouz and other fellow African writers who reached that stature, it gave recognition that this culture, our literature, is able to reach this, to be recognized on the international arena, and to be welcomed and appreciated. And this, of course, is important because, especially in this globalized world, it makes dissemination of knowledge, of culture, of heritage, and also of how this part of the world feels, how this part of the world reflects on issues, what are the challenges which are facing our societies, and how we deal and reflect and respond to it.
In totality, Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, Najib Mahfouz of Egypt, and Al-Taib Saleh of Sudan are considered as the fathers of modern African literature. They inspired generations of writers across the continent. No matter how they have passed away, people all over the world will always remember them for their extraordinary works and achievements.